Labrīt, kolēģi! Es domāju, ka mēs jau varētu sākt. Es ceru, ka jums visiem sanāca laiku bišķiņ izbaudīt brokastis. Droši šīs nav brokastu beigas, joprojām ēdamais ir, gan saldējs ēdiens, gan viss. Es gribēju ļoti jums pateikties par to, ka jūs esat šeit ar mums kopā. Un mēs uzsākam. Šodien ir mūsu pirmais semināra sadaļa, kuru mēs gribētu turpināt. Kopā viņi būs 3, un mēs runāsim par darījumiem. Par darījumiem Baltijas valstīs, par darījumiem Latvijā. Mēs runāsim par to, kā veidojās darījumu cikls un ko mēs arī kā profesionāļi un konsultanti redzam šajā darījumu ciklā notiekot. Un, ziniet, bija ļoti interesanta viena statistikas gabals. Mēs šogad aptaujājām uzņēmējus un prasījām uzņēmējiem, ko tad viņi domā, kā viņi domā augt nākamgad. Un lielāku tiesu mūsu Baltijas uzņēmēji ir atbildējuši, ka viņi taisās, Latvijas uzņēmēji ir atbildējuši, ka viņi grasās vairāk investēt jaunu preču un pakalpojumu ražošanā, jā. Bet daļa no uzņēmējiem pateica, ka viņi taisās veikt darījumus. Un tie, kas bija uz mūsu CEO prezentāciju, noteikti to ir redzējuši. Un tagad es pāriešu angļu valodā, jo mūsu viesi runās angliski. Un mēs turpināsim visu pārējo stāstamo gabalu vairāk angliski. And now I will switch in English, and I would like to introduce our speakers, actually. The first speaker will be Stephen Oldfield, is our good friend for Latvia. Stephen and I, we have worked on some projects before, and Stephen will say some words about him, but what I remember how he was characterizing himself, he's saying, I'm a company doctor. And I do believe that Stephen is a company doctor. And then we have Tit Tende. Tit is our Baltic advisory leader. Tit is involved in the transaction in the whole Baltic states and could give you some background of what is happening. And Raimons Dausks, who is leading our advisory here in Latvia and will tell you more about what is happening. The cycle of our series of the event is split into 3 parts. Today we will be talking about how and what to do in order to decide whether to go for a transaction. The second one is when the decision is made, what to do about the transaction, how to make it more efficient. And the third one is the post-integration, because we could see that both 3 parts are very important for transaction to happen and for them to be the most efficient for your business. And now I would like to give a word really to professionals who are working in this. Stephen, the word is yours.
So good morning, everybody. A lovely, sunny Riga morning. I really enjoy being in Latvia. I was privileged to be the Honorary Chairman of the Foreign Investors Council here for 3 years, between 2014 and 2017. And I've also done some projects with Zlata in Latvia. I am a company doctor, and the doctoring I had to do was lepojas metal, which was not an easy task. I'm sure we can talk about it later. I also dealt with PZU, the Polish insurance company, when it purchased insurance, the national insurance business in Lithuania back in 2014. And we worked with the regulator on making sure that PZU then took their PZU Lithuania business and sold it out, which was part of the competition's requirements for the deal. And that is a theme I will come back to later about the regulator's impact on this market of buying and selling businesses. In the more recent times, back in the UK, I've been involved in all types of transactions. The most notable one was probably the work on Glencore, which was a global trader where we actually acted on behalf of a Canadian pension scheme, purchasing 40% of Glencore Agriculture as a portfolio investment. And I think this is quite interesting in terms of portfolio management and the kinds of investors that are now coming forward to take stakes in businesses of all sorts of sizes. And you're seeing an emergence of sovereign wealth funds, of pension schemes, and of funds more generally. So we will come back to that theme a little bit later. I've also worked a lot with private equity, mainly on buy side, on due diligence, commercial due diligence, but also financial due diligence. Recently working with Exponent on the purchase of a dairy business in the UK, and more recently on a sale of a technology and media business on behalf of private equity. That deal has been stopped by Brexit, and I will come on to talk about Brexit a little bit later. It was launched in October, and typically a 6-month period for that kind of deal, and it got delayed as a result of the uncertainty over Brexit, and I will talk about Brexit a little bit later. Okay, so a little bit around some context for this morning's breakfast. First of all, just a little bit on global deals. Note that this starts in 2009. So after the financial crisis, a gradual increase of deals in the world going up. And last year was a story of two halves. There were a lot more mega deals going on in the world last year in the first half, which drove a lot of the value of global deals. So 9% up in Q1 of 2019. But if you look at how that is distributed across the world, I just wanted to give you a bit of a snapshot of what's going on. So you will see here that globally, both on count and on value, things are relatively stable. Year on year, you've actually got some growth. Q4 slightly slowing down. Geopolitical tension. Geopolitical tension, you've been reading about what Trump has just been doing. On Sunday, he announced that his delay in the tariffs on Chinese trade, which he delayed in January, is now going to be implemented because he's not believing the Chinese are playing the game. So this is causing uncertainty in the globe, and you're seeing a slight slowdown in deal value and deal count globally as a result of those geopolitical and trade concerns. If we then turn to Europe, Europe had a strong first half, but less in the second half. And again, some of the geopolitical was here. There was also one theme for Europe which is probably worth talking about, which is the framework for foreign direct investment that was announced. Have you heard about this? So this is the concern by some of Europeans' regulators that foreign direct investment from non-European sovereign wealth in particular and governmental investment is perhaps not healthy in certain sectors, energy sector being one. So something which is politically and socially important for a European territory, maybe the answer is no to foreign direct investment, which is going to stifle some of the growth. The other thing in Europe that you're seeing as well is the competition authorities. So in the UK, we had a big retail. I was talking to my colleague from Mondelez a few minutes ago. The Sainsbury-Asda big grocery deal was stopped by the Competition Commission in the UK. And this was because it was felt not to be competitively appropriate for consumers, even though they promised £1 billion worth of savings on grocery bills. But it did not go through. Another one to bring it a little bit closer to home in Germany was the merger between Siemens and Alstom, which again was stopped by the Competition Commission. And moving from regulator then through to mergers more generally, have I got any bankers in the room? No? So Deutsche Commerzbank has been on and off and on and off for about 2 years. But in the last week, they've called it off. So now the question is Commerzbank going to be bought by ING or UniCredit? This is where the betting is at the moment. Okay, just another thing around the market generally. There's a lot of what the deal market calls dry powder around. So dry powder is the amount of money around for deals. And PE in particular is collecting a lot of dry powder. Current estimates are there's $2 trillion worth of dry powder out there looking for deals. And because of the cost of borrowing money, particularly with the Fed having kept interest rates low, this is driving valuations. So valuations are getting higher because there's a lot of money chasing deals, so there's a lot of demand, and the cost of borrowing is relatively cheap. Just to give a little bit of context, and again for the more local discussion that Tet and Raymond are going to talk about, the US accounts for 50% of all global deals. Europe is significantly less, at about a quarter of that value in the US. So the US market really matters. And so the other thing I just wanted to mention in terms of global was Asia. Have any of you done deals with Chinese or Asian investors before? So I have, and Asia is going a little bit subdued in relation to Europe. And there's only been 16 deals in Europe done by Asian companies in the first quarter of this year. Now, I've got two observations on that, having worked with them. One is that they're very slow. They're very slow to do a deal. Sovereign wealth funds out of the Middle East are similarly slow, in my experience, but Asian investors are slow as well. So actually, as a deal maker, trying to get engagement from sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East or from funds in Asia is hard, even trade parties in Asia as well. Chinese trade parties are notoriously difficult to get moving. They don't like auctions either. So only 16 deals by Asian investors in the first quarter of this year. And the other thing about Asian investors is, following a number of quite high-profile poor acquisitions, is they like their due diligence, and they do due diligence and due diligence and due diligence. It's also a theme of Japanese trading houses. Again, has anybody done any deals with Japanese trading houses? They, again, like the due diligence. And I'm looking at Tet now because certainly I have done due diligence for Japanese trading houses, and they keep going and going and going into the detail. It's extraordinary. And it does take a lot of time and effort to get them across the line. Okay, I promised to talk a bit about the UK. And I'll come on to trends in a minute, and I'll come on to Brexit. But just a little bit before I start on the UK M&A market, we do think there's probably going to be a mild recession coming in the UK as a result of Brexit. I've already been talking to some of our colleagues here at breakfast about real estate prices in central London. They're going down, and there is no doubt Brexit has had an effect on it. That is cooling consumer sentiment, and it's cooling consumer confidence. Despite that, the M&A market has been reasonable, and that's been fueled by the weakness of sterling. So if you look at the M&A markets, please remember foreign exchange. You're in the Eurozone here. You need to be aware of the euro versus the dollar. Given the power of the American dollar in the global M&A market, please track the dollar against the euro when you're thinking about transactions, because it's really, really important. So in the UK, we've actually had inbound investment go up 30%, and that's purely because of the cost of investment going down. Generally, though, the UK is subdued, and that brings me on to Brexit. It's a mess. Brexit, is it worth it, is in the middle of that slide. For the first time, I was, again, talking earlier, for the first time that I can remember, the confidence in the democratic process of government is at an all-time low in the UK. People are frankly fed up with the political parties playing politics to the expense of the country and to the expense of certainty. And business, as you all know, depends on certainty, and at the moment we've got uncertainty. You probably don't follow this as closely, obviously, as a UK national, but we had a number of indicative votes in Parliament about different options for Brexit, and none of them came to any majority. There was no majority decision, even with a number of options. May's deal is still on the table, and Labour and Conservative are talking about trying to get a consensus. This may involve a customs union, this is most likely, but is it a permanent customs union or a temporary customs union? If it is a permanent customs union, May is threatened with a split in her party, in the Tory party, which is the ruling party in government, and that could be very serious for the Conservative Party. People are saying, why hasn't May gone? It's because she's got the toughest job in the country and nobody wants it, in my opinion. So uncertainty is not good for M&A, it's not good for business. It has been quite good for PwC. I was comparing notes with Zlata, and our business in the UK is doing well because there are a lot of questions which business are asking and not a lot of answers, and therefore a lot of planning being required. And this is a theme that I know Raymond's and Ted are going to pick up later, the importance of planning. And I guess that links neatly on to a few quotes. Before anything, preparation is the key to success. The telephone, this was Alexander Bell who invented the telephone. This is, anybody know who that is? Benjamin Franklin. So by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. And the final one, and I've got an M&A story around this, is luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And here is a global M&A insight. KKR, American investor, is targeting Japan. Does anybody know why? So in the 70s, American conglomerates broke up. GE is the best example. Now, with the changes in governance and transparency, which has been championed by Prime Minister Abe, the KKR investment board believe that Japan is a good place for conglomerate divestment. So they're looking at Hitachi, Toshiba, and Panasonic, and saying businesses like this are going to divest some of the very, very broad church of activity in their businesses. And so in that particular case, they're targeting Japan. And this is the point I wanted to make, that its preparation is meeting opportunity. They're preparing for it. They're taking the playbooks, as they call them, from the 1970s on GE and replaying them 30, 40 years later in Japan, actually creating the opportunity. Okay, so just one final slide from me, and this is my Led Zeppelin tribute, so A Stairway to Heaven. And this is what, when I'm working with clients on trying to drive a deal, I try and populate. The words aren't important, it's the diagram that is. This is what most businesses should have before they even start, to get to a value that they hope for. These are the things can make it go bad, and these are the things that can make it go even better. And it's really important to map this out before you start. So with that, I'm going to have questions I know at the end, but with that I'm going to hand over to Ted, who's going to pick up from a more regional perspective. But good morning to you all, and I look forward to questions later.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning from me, everybody as well. I'm Ted Tender. I'm partner in PwC firm, and I'm also coordinating the advisory practice in the Baltics for us. And the advisory practice here in the Baltics is about 80 people strong across 3 countries. and we have about 20 plus people doing just transactions every day, Raimond and me included. My background is almost all my life I've been doing transactions. I started as a young civil servant in what was called then Estonian Privatization Agency in the middle of 90s. And after that, closer to 2000s, I actually joined PwC, and ever since I've been doing deals in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, for a short time also in Russia, in the Russian PwC team. And doing that now even more regionally in terms of the Baltics, because I'm sure as most of you notice, the transactions that are happening here are often very cross-Baltic, if not even wider scale. My background, obviously, and where I come from is Estonia. I'm an Estonian. Unlike many Estonians who are probably at this point in Latvia and driving towards Latvia, I'm not here for alcohol today, but to talk about M&A. Although I've done that as well, to be honest, not because I need, but that's a protest against Estonian government policies. But that's as to my background. My aim with my slides and my stories is really to get close to what is important when preparing for the deals. And I'm gonna give you a few examples from our own projects, our own work, which we've seen gone wrong with clients. Some of them because of poor preparation, some of them for other reasons. But I hope these examples are gonna help you also when you are planning deals, either on buy or sell side, go through them smoothly and hopefully efficiently. But first, a few background slides, and this is actually both this slide and the next slide are the information from Merger Market and law firm LX, who've analyzed the Baltic deals market for many years by quarters. And I didn't, now that Stephen spoke, I was a little sad that I didn't include the whole spectrum that they have in their reports, because that would have exactly followed the trend that Stephen was talking about. But here, what you can see here is that the deal activity in the Baltics actually has been pretty high across the past 5 years. Obviously, you would see the downs and spikes if you were to look longer back. But what has happened in the past couple of years, and this slide includes only 2018 figures as the last year, is that again, as Stephen was indicating, the deals have gotten larger, the valuations have gotten up, and some of the multiples that we've seen have been really unbelievable. But I'm gonna calm your optimism about that a bit later on with what I think is the actual sort of nature of the Baltic market. This also, as I said, from Merger Market and LX, this aims to show the largest deals in last year in the Baltics. And you see some of the Latvian flags here as well. Some of the flags are actually misguiding because many deals are actually cross-Baltic. Luminor certainly isn't the Baltic deal at all. The deal was done in Sweden, obviously, but many of those transactions they are involving all 3 Baltic countries and have truly been big. We've seen and are seeing, actually at this point we are finalizing one transaction which probably going to reach news in a few days, which is also very large. But the deals we've had in the last year, and now we've seen some of the investors that we haven't seen for many years actually in the Baltics. Some of them are here first time, and that's particularly because of the size of the deals. Some of the investors are only coming for size, as I'm gonna briefly touch upon later. But then again, this is 10 largest deals accounted for by Merger Market and LX. It doesn't describe the market as such. I mean, as with economy, market is made by smaller and medium deals rather than those large ones. Obviously interesting to look at, but that doesn't tell how the market really looks like, at least in my opinion. I have characterized the different investors. This is sort of my view and my creation in a sense. Who do we see doing transactions in the Baltics? What is their backgrounds? What are they looking for in the deals? And I've divided them into the sort of matrix that one angle shows the nature of the investors, either strategic or financial investors, and the other angle shows sort of more local versus international angle, if you like. And if I start with the Baltic private equity, PE is the private equity, obviously here, which I think from our point of view on the deals that we are working with Raimond's, this is probably the most often that we see Baltic private equity firms. You know, there are a few larger ones, Livonia, Balticap, all of them are doing deals across the Baltics, in Valda from Lithuania, a few others. They are the ones that we see most active and most often. You won't see them often because, you know, some of the deals they won't do, they will back down, or they will simply, you know, not get the asset, but they are very, very active. If I go to international private equities, which I just a minute ago mentioned as well, then they are really, I should say, not rarely, but they are not as often here. And the reason for that is the keyword that I've put on the slide, size. They're always looking for right size, and the ones that are investing, say, below 10 million or maybe even lower, there are, you know, really few of them that would come from elsewhere and invest into the Baltics. So that's and that kind of gives you the background that if you were to sell a business, then large international private equities are interested only in very large deals in Baltic terms. What I didn't mention about the Baltic private equities, and this is actually true for all the private equity companies, is that they are obviously looking for growth. If you have a company which is, you know, solidly growing but not quickly or doesn't have any M&A plans, then it is quite likely that the Baltic private equities, or any other private equities for that matter, wouldn't be interested or would be looking for the acquisition with something else together so that they could combine the different acquisitions. As to the strategic investors, the other sort of frequent investor group that we see obviously is the local strategic investors, but not in a way that we see private equity firms, but more, you know, directing their investments into obviously the industries that they are interested in. And this has actually been quite active over the past, let's say, 2-3 years. That I mean, obviously you've seen a few Lithuanian companies here, and we've seen in Estonia, Lithuanians are very aggressive and active in the market, and obviously very good business people as well. So they are expanding across the Baltics, sometimes as VP Group, even further to Scandinavia. What comes to international strategic investors, then this is an interesting area that I think before the crisis, before 2007, 2008, we saw a lot of international strategic investors here. And I think the reason, to be honest, then was that it was more important to do transactions rather than look real value in them. And Raimond is gonna be talking about the value in deals and how you make deals work and which deals work and which don't. But that sentiment has changed dramatically after the crisis. I mean, you've seen in Latvia, we've seen in the Baltics in a wider terms that strategic investors that, you know, were running to the Baltics are actually leaving the Baltic countries. I mean, the obvious reasons all of us can mention, you know, size, complexity of doing business, because, you know, although being similar across the Baltics, we still have all of our own legal systems, languages, everything. So being here is sometimes, you know, more complicated for them than being, I don't know, Sweden, which has the same number of people, but, you know, economy is much bigger, and obviously the legal system is one apart from, you know, here being 3 different ones. So this is clearly a drastic move that we've seen. Of course, some of them still come back, but it has to be really directed and really well thought through target for them and acquisition in the process. What I aim to show here and sort of continue from just the last words that I had about the strategic investors, that if you were to sell a company, for instance, or part of the company, then finding those strategic players from Europe or even wider scale is very, very difficult. It's as I said before, Baltics is not a center of investor attention, unfortunately. We have to admit. Therefore, if you want to do a good deal, you really have to work for it. And another thing, capital availability, which Stephen mentioned. I think there's also a trick there, that although there's a lot of capital available around the globe, obviously, it's they're very selective these days. Where do they put their money? They can throw 5 million on a startup which simply has an idea on 5 slides. But then again, they won't come here and invest into a solid business which shows cash flows and all that, because it's not strategically interesting for them. So therefore, the fact itself that capital is available, yes, sometimes it can drive the multiples up, but then again, these days it doesn't guarantee that you actually find a suitable buyer who's willing to pay suitable price for your assets that you're trying to sell. Now, just a few words about the advisor's role, and many of you actually are working with us and different advisors, and I'm sure you've seen the use and what advisors can do. But sometimes I think it's best to characterize from the buy side that whenever we are advising somebody who's buying something, and it's not a structured process, that just negotiations between two parties, then almost our first question is that does the seller has an advisor? Because we've been through some really difficult processes where you don't understand the information is slow to come, people simply don't understand each other, what it needs to be done in order to make the transaction happen. And it's very logical, because if you think about your everyday business, it's something industry, it's retail, manufacturing, IT, whatever. And then when you are making transactions with particularly private equity players who are doing deals every day, so it's kind of logical that if you are discussing their industry with them, then it's going to be difficult for you or any other business that is not every day in M&A transactions, but trying to concentrate on their everyday manufacturing, retail, or whatever it is then. And now I'll talk about the areas which I think we've mostly seen in transactions which cause problems, and which are the ones that investors are looking at closely. And hopefully there's going to be a few tips. Either you're on the sell side or buy side, which you need to consider, and which are often very important and sometimes unnoticed in deals before they already are well into the process. I mean, this is the sort of basics, yeah. If the core operations of the company are solid and well understandable, transparent, this is something that the investors will be looking for. I'll give you an example. We just recently worked on the transaction which actually fell apart, and particularly for the reason of the operations not being well understood by the investors. We actually discovered it through doing a due diligence on the financial and legal side, but there were different transactions with related companies. Revenues were flowing in from strange places. It was a regulated business. We actually discovered that there were some legal risks involved, which meant that there could have been actions from the regulator's side. And this is something that every business has some areas which are not perfect. But this is simply something that if you are selling or buying, it's better taken care of before you actually go into the transaction. And therefore, this is something that financial and legal consultants often can't help from the the core activity point of view, but clearly something that needs to be in order for any deal even start or get well into the next stages. Yeah. Then again, something which is not financial or not very sort of fact-based, but the information quality which relates to the management quality is very, very important, particularly again with the private equity investors who are very often buying actually managements or well-managed companies because the companies are well-managed and the management is willing to stay, and sometimes they are given financial incentives to stay there. This is again something that we often see that when you, and again particularly on the buy side, you always the sellers are saying we have perfect information, everything is ready, we can do the deal within a month, and then always you go in, you understand that actually the information is not understandable, it's messy, and again this is not very difficult to make right, but sometimes gets overlooked, and we've seen deals falling apart, deals being delayed for many months, and this is something that nobody can really afford because time is cost for you, for your advisors. So this is another very important aspect when preparing for deals. And then few really financial areas that we are normally looking at when analyzing the companies for our clients who are buying the companies. And just a couple of examples. I mean, obviously the three areas that we normally look at are basically cash flows or earnings or EBITDA, as some of you know, the net working capital, which is actually one of the most overlooked and underestimated and complex areas in transactions, where I'll give you an example later on, which can cost you a lot of money. And then net debt, where I want to mention the valuations and the potential difference of understanding in what the value of the company is as well. And maybe I'll start with that actually, because we've seen, again, several transactions where you go into the deal, you understand that some price level has been agreed, and then you start realizing that it has been agreed by the owner of one company and the CEO of another company, and they've been talking about 10 million euros, and nobody really knows what this 10 million euros means. So therefore, especially professional investors, when they are talking about the enterprise values or the values that they are willing to pay, it is a term enterprise value, which means without cash, without liabilities, and then that either adds to the value or subtracts from the value. But very often we've actually seen that where people are simply agreeing something and not sure what they are talking about. And again, when you realize that well into the process, all due diligence done, everything prepared, and then suddenly you're back to the basics that we have a value gap of X million euros, can be quite costly. Now jumping to the front of the slide, the quality of earnings, as we call it, or EBITDA or cash flows, basically. This is obviously core of the value of the company. What the company is able to produce in the future. When we look at it, we normally try to establish that what is the sustainable level of EBITDA or cash flows. So, you would have all sorts of one-offs. You would, for instance, have sold something last year which increased your EBITDA. This is something that the investors will instantly subtract from the sort of sustainable cash flows. You might have, on the positive side, we were just doing a transaction where it was owner-managed company, and there were a lot of private costs inside the company. So the EBITDA that you could have deduced from the official accounts was actually much smaller than the EBITDA when stripping the company of all of those non-business related costs. And again, you want to do that before the transaction, because again, the same example that we were in, that has a risk of undermining the investor trust in you. And also for us, actually, it was quite embarrassing to find out well into the process that the owner hadn't told us that there were some sort of strange things in the costs, which they were a little bit afraid to tell us because it might have tax consequences. But then again, if you are risking several millions euros because you haven't made sure people understand it the same way, it's not really worth it normally. Now going into the net working capital, which I mentioned is quite complex. And again, a couple of examples. There was a deal several years ago already where net working capital level was ignored in the share purchase agreement. And what happened was that the SPA was signed, and obviously there was some time until closing, when only the initial value and net debt were taken into account. What the sellers did was that they actually tried to get as much money in, calling in all the receivables, everything that could increase the cash, and it wasn't reflected in the net working capital. So what happened was that when the buyer took company over, it actually had to invest further into the company in order to make it sort of operable, because every company needs working capital. Yeah. And this is why I mentioned target level here. Normally in the deals, what you try to do is that throughout the due diligence process, you try to establish the target level of the net working capital, and then any changes in that, it could be positive, it could be negative. It is reflected in the net debt in the same manner, so that no money is lost from the transaction in between the signing and the actual closing, or the sort of effect when the company changes really hands. On another side, we are now trying to help one client who we didn't work with on the transaction on the sell side. They also ignored it because they thought that the transaction could be closed really quickly, but actually it took 6 months from, I think they were accounting for 1 month. And every business has seasonality, and when you buy a company, when it starts receiving the cash versus when it starts spending the cash, obviously the value is different. And again, the seller is actually in trouble because they were thinking to sell the company sort of at cash, but it turned, and suddenly you have an issue. And that was an experience in as investor actually, so that was especially surprising. And further in the net debt area, you can have what we would be looking for. You can have future commitments. For instance, you have committed capex. There's something that is already signed, which is not in the balance sheet yet. But again, if this is cash outflow from the company, you would want, as a buyer, you would want to take that into account and obviously decrease the level that you are paying to the seller. So in summary, I was a bit hectic with different things. I tried to give you as many examples as possible, but I think from all of our experience, and we've done collectively transactions many years, the preparation is something that you really can't underestimate, and particularly because it costs a lot of money to you, both on the buy and on the sell side. And it's I think it's a very short-sighted view that if I'm buying something and the seller is incompetent, that maybe I can sort of squeeze something more out of him or her when I'm doing the transaction. Would you really want to go to the court afterwards and spend money on this process? So I think whatever the situation, transparency and people understanding each other well and in the same manner is actually for everybody's interest. So preparation, as they say in whatever Lenin said that about studying. And I wouldn't underestimate competent advice either. And again, not trying to further sell ourselves on you, but even as I said, even if we work on the buy side, we would always prefer somebody working on the sell side, similar to us, because that will make everybody's life easier. That will make transaction much more efficient, and hence, hopefully, everybody's going to be more happy after 6 months, after a year, after 2 years as well. You won't find anything which was hidden or not seen before. Yeah. So thanks very much. Also later on, happy to discuss with Stephen and answer any questions. I'm going to hand over to my good colleague Raimond then.
Thank you. So, as already mentioned by Ted, so my name is Raimond Dogs. I'm the head of advisory in Latvia. A couple of words about myself. So, I've been in this business for 15 years, mostly in Latvia, although I spent 6 years in the US. I got my MBA there, and then I was working in M&A and consulting for another big 4 firm. So, I said that I've been a part of about 10 transactions in the US, and some of them were taking place in Brazil, so I spent some time there. And now I'm back in Latvia for 1.5 years, and I'm helping with deals here. So what I'd like to do today is focus on the M&A strategy part. So this is kind of the theme of the conversation that Zlata was saying earlier, and I think its relevance has not changed since the days of Sun Tzu, of the Art of War. So essentially what it says that the strategy is, the right strategy is the right route to the victory. So, so you have to get the strategy right, and then if one thing that you get right, it should be the strategy, because chances are if you will get that piece wrong, then you will be unsuccessful all along. So quite often when I see a deal happening and I'm just thinking to myself, so why are they doing that? I mean, chances are this will not work out. And many years later, you take a look, well, yeah, it didn't work out. I mean, there are some surprises and some exceptions, but all in all, this is what we see. So in my presentation later, I will speak about some of the myths of M&A, about what people think is true, and chances are that's actually not true. Then I will cover a couple of aspects about, based on the PwC studies, about what has actually proven to work and what are good examples of that. And then finally, some of the suggestions about when you think about M&A, about strategy, what you should be looking at, what are the things that you should keep in mind. So with that, let's start with kind of M&A myths, and maybe a question to the audience, what do you think are widespread beliefs which are actually not true about M&A, which should not be the basis for your strategy building? I'll start with one, that M&A deals create value on average. I mean, probably the statistics will tell you, depending on where you will take a look at, that from 50 to 80% of all M&A deals fail to achieve the initial value creation objectives. So in most instances, I mean, as they say in the Hunger Games, may the odds be in your favor, but if you talk about M&A deals, the odds are typically not in your favor. So maybe some other myths that you think might be widespreadly believed, but that are not accurate. I'll tell you a couple. So these are based on the study done by one of my MBA professors of M&A, Jay Anand, which I believe were quite relevant for today's discussion. And I'll tell you a couple of examples of those later on, but let's say on this slide I'll just mention the two, that most acquisitions improve performance of the buyer, or that high technology or high growth targets lead to better performance, which are a little bit similar. So the idea here is that what you have to keep in mind that the high performance, high growth companies often have people, processes, technology in place that actually enable those companies to grow. So when a big strategic player acquires them, which have their own processes, systems, and so forth. So whenever they start to establish the corporate culture and the systems onto the new company, those initial competitive advantage may erode. And you might actually end up in a state when you have acquired the company, it is becoming more like you, so it's not growing as quickly, and you're not actually able to take on some of the best examples that you'd like to take from that. A couple other examples from here. So acquisition of only good targets is a good strategy, and we'll see in a couple of next examples that's not necessarily the case, and quite often the opposite holds true. So an example here about like Walmart and Vulco. So Walmart, as you know, is the largest retailer in the world, and Vulco was it was a company established in the US. It had large subsidiaries in Canada, in the UK, and it went bankrupt. So essentially they acquired 25 years ago their Canadian operations. And it was also interesting how Walmart acquired them. Well, they were underperforming and they acquired 120 stores, and that was the way how they entered the Canadian market. And then since then it has gone up and up, and they are now the second largest player in Canada. What was also interesting, when they acquired them, there were 140 stores, but they acquired 120. So they didn't buy the stores which had unionized workers, and they didn't buy the downtown stores. So even when they were doing the acquisitions, they were very explicit about what they were looking for, and also very explicit about what they were not looking to do. So, and we'll talk about the core competencies, and that's one of the key things that you have to understand what you're good at, what you can do, and what you cannot do. And if you feel that this will not be a good fit, then you should not do that. So vertical integration helps capture greater profits. Well, typically vertical integration is not a great idea unless there are some market inefficiencies in place. And there are some industries like in agriculture or in energy sector or in like wood manufacturing that you want to secure your, let's say, supply chains, and then it makes sense. But in free market, like in this example, when Pepsi acquired like Taco Bell, another Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut, where they felt that, okay, so we'll buy restaurant chains and then we'll have a stable place where we can sell our Pepsi. So what happened? Any guesses? So for once, it turned out that those businesses are not as easy to manage as Pepsi. As well, that's a different business altogether. So they were underperforming, and they struggled to produce the value that they were looking for. At the same time, what happened was Coca-Cola went to Wendy's and other competitors that were using Pepsi and were saying, hey guys, I mean, they're now competing against you. Like, do you really want to have Pepsi in your stores? And these companies said, well, you're right. So like they lost some of their biggest clients whom they started competing against. And Coca-Cola was now the incumbent soft drink. So this is just one example of kind of unintended consequences that vertical integration can bring to your business that you have to be aware of. And as I said, this typically doesn't create value. And this one, also, it's quite often heard that if you think about BCG matrix, that if you're in a quadrant, you should look for stars and you should invest in new opportunities. And this is quite often not the right approach to begin with. And there are several reasons for that. And one here, if a company acquires other company that is working, let's say, in somewhat different business, and if you look at the holdings, then the market typically gives a discount or has a discount to the combined holding company than if they were separate companies. And that's one of the key reasons why you have seen a large multi-billion spin-offs taking place in the world. So just to give you an example, I was a part of 3 such spin-offs in the US, and one that I was working on quite for like half a year was Money to Walk. Anyone knows what Money to Walk company is? So it's based out of Wisconsin. It's about $2 billion revenue company, which had 2 business divisions. One was creating cranes, like really big cranes for construction. And second, they had food service business division, which was making like freezers for McDonald's and so forth. Sorry, also like B2B business. So their valuation trade multiple was around 7-ish EBITDA. And the idea was that the cranes business got typically evaluated around like 6 EBITDA, and the food service business was evaluated like 11, 12 EBITDA multiple. So and the businesses, the food service was slightly smaller than Cranes. But if you pull them together, then what the market typically was doing, they were adjusting the combined multiple to the lowest of the two companies and increasing it only slightly. And that has been the reason for all those corporate spin-offs that essentially if you divide them up, even without taking into account that you would need like different processes and models because of like, let's say Cranes business is very seasonal, not seasonal, but cyclical, and food service is not, and so forth. So you'd have to prepare differently. Just the multiple perspective, you would get more by separating the businesses than having those together. So with that, I think that's a good segue to the next section about that you have to be very careful when you're making the acquisitions in terms of even if you're in a falling industry, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you will buy a good company that like your both company will be worth together more than they currently are, as they currently are. So with that, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about large M&A study done by PwC where we looked at 540 deals. Just to take a look and to understand, so what is the key driver that has some correlation with successful outcome of the deal? And the key criteria that was identified was the capabilities of a company, of a buyer. So essentially you can divide 3 deals into the 3 categories. So the first one is that, and let's take our key and core capabilities of our company as a basis. So the first one is we have our capabilities and we'll buy a company that will enhance our capabilities. So as an example, so Disney up until the acquisition of Pixar, and Pixar are making digital animation movies. So up until that point in time, all the Disney movies were drawn by hand. So that was going into a little bit different direction, but they felt that that could kind of enhance their capabilities and they could use that. So that's kind of example of the first one. The second one is leverage deals where you have your current capabilities and you apply them essentially to companies that are operating in the same sector that you are operating in and improving their performance that way. An example here, Sub Miller, that's like UK, it used to be UK when they acquired Foster's Group, Australian brewing company. So that's in the beer market. So Foster's Group was the Australian beer market leader, but they themselves were in trouble because a few years earlier, the beer company had acquired also the wine business. So that seemed like a good idea. So they will be the market leader both in beer and wines, but it didn't turn out that way. So they were actually had to write off substantial amounts for the wine business. They were in not so good shape. So then the Sub Miller came in and acquired them and actually kind of improved their performance. And that's a good example where you can leverage your good capabilities and take it from there. The last one is limited fit deals, in which if you think about your core capabilities, what your company has, and you acquire other company which is somewhat unrelated. So the first one is Kmart and Sears. Who knows who are these two companies? So Kmart could be like Maxima of Latvia, and Sears could be like Depot-ish kind of. Mm-hmm. So they figured, yeah, let's combine. There's 2 strong market leaders. I mean, makes sense. Well, it turned out that it doesn't actually make much sense because there was very little overlap between anything almost. As you still had to run them as separate businesses, it turned out that the financial systems and kind of the administrative overhead didn't make sense to unite them also, as they were running on separate systems and so forth. So they were running as different businesses, but kind of with one ownership and one leadership, and that's one of the kind of like hallmarks of acquisitions that didn't make much sense and turned out to be quite disastrous for both companies. As Sears, I mean, both they're struggling, and Sears has been close to bankrupt for like multiple years now. The second is eBay and Skype. Probably these two companies you're aware of. So when eBay acquired Skype, they were thinking, so when people are buying something, they might want to chat to a representative, so let's buy Skype. After a year, they realized, well, people actually don't want to talk over Skype with their representatives. And what they did was then they sold it off to a PE house that later on sold it off to Microsoft, and they recognized a loss of about 1.5 billion. I think they acquired it for 3.4 billion, the Skype initially. I mean, on the bright side, when they sold it to the PE firm, they sold 70% and they left 30% to themselves. And when the PE firm sold to the Microsoft, they actually recouped for their 30% all of their initial investment. So that's also sometimes a good way how to find a better buyer, but to leave yourself a chance of an upside if it works out eventually. So what we found out is that enhancement deals, the first months when you're acquiring a company that has some capabilities that you'd like to bring into your company, I mean, all in all, they add value slightly above to what you would see on the market average. The best deals by far are the ones which are in the middle, where you have your key core capabilities that you realize like which those are, and are buying companies to which you can apply those capabilities and make those companies better. And I think when I look in this room, like several of good examples of companies which have made such acquisitions also come to mind in Latvia's case. And the last one, limited fit deal. So this is typically destroying shareholder value. I mean, it just doesn't work, right? And some of the kind of examples in Latvia, just to illustrate that. So last year, and we were actually representing the buyer on the first one when Kesko Senukai acquired 1A internet store. So as I said, again, they had a little bit of a digital footprint, but certainly this takes it to the next level and brings them into the new market. So the jury is still out there whether this will be a successful deal or not, but it's in the category in which it could make sense. The second, leverage deals like Oracle and NP Foods, that's kind of also quite understandable and straightforward. And Oracle has been a serial acquirer. I mean, the Spilva and then the Oracle division. So they also had trained on some smaller deals along the way. And I think all in all, we can all agree that it has been a good acquisition for them, and they have taken the existing brands forward. And the last, there are several deals that probably in some other industries that I don't want to bring up because they're like kind of confidential, but this was very publicly well known that Ķirsons decided that, okay, let's make Lido design rūpnīca. And as he admitted himself that has been his biggest mistake in his entrepreneurship, Lido design rūpnīca is essentially they wanted to make eco houses. So they wanted to have 200 people to build 200 eco houses, and well, it turned out that that food business is quite different to building eco houses, especially like after the crisis. And all the cross collaterals between the businesses that were there were dragging out or dragging down the core business. And so this is the example, not maybe necessarily of M&A, but in Latvian instance, like several entrepreneurs come to mind who have thought, okay, so I've built a really good business in this industry, so I'll build a good business in that industry. And quite often it hasn't worked out, as then you take also often a loan for your second business, you give a cross collateral of your main business, and then all of a sudden both businesses are in trouble. And then hopefully you can kind of save your main business and somehow divest the second one. So the key thing here, also kind of a takeaway that I'll speak also on the next slide, is that management capabilities should not be considered as kind of a competitive advantage of a company that you can leverage to improve the performance of other companies. So over the years, there has been one company that claimed that their competitive advantage is like good management practices. the best in the world in managing the companies, and that's how they justified the fact that under one roof they had typically I think it was 6 major divisions. So which is that company? Any ideas?
GE.
Yes, so that's GE. So they were saying, well, we're the smartest guys, so we know how to run different financial sector, and they have wind turbine business and whatnot. But as Warren Buffett said, and in the next slide you'll see the GE's performance, is that in the long run, this approach doesn't work, right? As he was saying, well, the managers believe that they're the princesses and the businesses that they acquire are toads, and when they will kiss them and all the magically will improve. But well, statistically doesn't seem to be that way. And for General Electric, who kind of historically have been saying that's have been their advantage, as you can see, they have been gradually falling off, and over the last few years, their stock is substantially below where it used to be, and now it's almost in a free fall. I think it's 30% of what it used to be a year ago. And they have also made quite a few mistakes on their own in terms of business strategy, making strange acquisitions, doing share buybacks when the share price is high, and doing very few share buybacks when the share price was low. So there's a multitude of issues that they have done wrong, but I think at the end of the day, it boils down also to the business strategy that good management as such cannot be your kind of competitive advantage that justifies having multiple businesses under one roof, which have no business in being under the same roof. So with that, based on kind of a summary of other PwC studies, some of the factors that distinguish good acquisitions from bad acquisitions, and these are the things that many of those I mentioned, and these are the things to kind of keep in mind. And I think most of those are kind of already known. And again, this is something that you have to take with a grain of salt, as you can have successful deals also from the second column. It's just much harder and much less likely to happen. So the key takeaway here is that it's kind of apparent that the most successful deals are if you know what you're doing good, and if you find a company to which you could easily apply what you are doing good, then chances are, or odds are, this deal will be more successful than if you're trying to do essentially anything else besides this. Also interesting about the synergies, that's typically the ones which are cost and capex related. Those deals are more successful than if it's revenue related. I mean, there can be some exceptions, let's say IT industry or Oracle or or Cisco, the ones which are serial acquirers who buy IT companies just to increase the sales. It's slightly different, but for more of a kind of general industries, this holds true. And from my experience, I can just tell you that it's extremely hard to track revenue synergies, even to come up with those. Then the question is how much is the price change, how much is our regular business, and so forth. So it's really hard to be successful without measuring something, and revenue synergies are just notoriously hard to measure. Capex and cost are so much easier, and that's one of the reasons why these things make much more sense. And the second from last also, it's also been in some other studies that frequent acquirers typically are more successful than infrequent acquirers, and that's something that also Ted mentioned before. As I mean, companies are good in doing what they're doing every day, but if they're doing something once in a lifetime, then chances are you might not know all the lessons learned that you might have learned if you have done 10 deals, and as with everything in life. So it makes sense to start maybe with smaller acquisitions to have some lessons learned, and then gradually to move to bigger ones. Like Eiropā, for example, they started with smaller acquisitions, expansion in Baltic countries, and then they acquired a large Swedish chain. And now they're looking to integrate that business. So with that, let me maybe finish with what I started with Sun Tzu. So, as he mentioned, victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. I think this is extremely applicable to M&A and to M&A strategy as such. So I think it is worth the effort to think through about what you are acquiring, why, and how does it fit into the broader business strategy and the capabilities of your enterprise. As if you get that part right, as it was mentioned by Sun Tzu earlier, then that might, even if you will get the tactics wrong, I mean, eventually your deal will be successful. But if you buy a company and then start thinking, okay, so I bought a company, so what I should do next? I mean, that's probably a recipe for some challenges later on. So with that, let me wrap up, and I guess we can move to the questions session. Thank you.
And what is the myth about the multiples, and what do you see in the market actually? What is going on?
So I will start with a global comment. So the private equity investors, on average, globally at the moment, the global average for a multiple is 11.2 times earnings, which is quite high. And the view is that that's been going up over the last 3 years. And there is a question as to whether or not there's a bubble in PE, and the bubble is going to burst. But when that was asked of the chief executive officer of KKR recently, he said, no, our investments are making money even at the prices we're paying. So I think that comes back a little bit to, I think, something Ted said, which was PE are informed investors and they buy when they can see value. So there's lots of money there, but they're not spending it, what in English we'd say willy-nilly, which means they're throwing it about. They're doing it very strategically and looking where the growth opportunities are and value is. So that's just a view of multiples from PE globally. But Baltics and Latvia?
I will comment my view. First, yes, I think private equity houses normally are paying higher multiples, but it can also be that, again, some of the deals that we've seen between the strategic investors, as I said before, some of the multiples have really been simply unbelievable. There's probably always a specific reason behind it, but all in all, it's true. But we also want to add a bit of sort of skepticism here about the professionalism in a sense, and you have to understand how private equity managers are squeezed from different angles, because if they have money which is unspent, they are likely to get fired. If they spend it unwisely, they are likely to get fired. So, which will happen first? Yeah, this is putting it into fund, of course, but in a way they can't afford money just sitting on their accounts either. So that's what pressuring a little bit the price levels and the multiples. Although I have to agree again with Stephen that they are certainly professionals, and they probably weigh their options pretty well.
And I think that brought up a good point. It depends on the fund life cycle. So chances are they will be spending higher multiples early on, but later on they will be increasingly selective and increasingly price sensitive. What's also very important to mention, what we were discussing with Stephen earlier, is the average prices in the UK are not 12 multiples, right? I guess you can comment on that a little bit more. So we were discussing that average prices in the UK is actually like 5 to 6 EBITDA, which is very similar to the price level that we are currently seeing in Baltics, and in Baltics in some instances is even slightly lower than that. So despite the fact that there are some deals that can go up to like 20 multiples or so, which are, let's say, very like capex intensive, and where you're buying more of an asset deal than get cash flow deal, and then the yields are different. All in all, I think that the average price levels are not that different globally than they are from what they are here. And to answer to your question, I mean, for the right investment, the PE funds obviously can pay more than strategic buyers. But then again, they're looking for companies that are more growth oriented, and that's why it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as in many instances the PE firms will not be interested in the stable, steady companies that the strategic players will be.
Just a comment on values. As you know, Zlata in the introduction said I'm a company doctor. When a company has to sell, it drives the value down. When a company does not have to sell, it means there is immediate competitive tension of, okay, I will not sell. And one of the things I always say in these kinds of environments is I get really, in English we say cheesed off. It means I get pissed off, I get cheesed off with what I call the corporate finance junkie. Because the corporate finance junkie is just interested in getting a deal away. If the deal isn't right for the seller or for the buyer, there shouldn't be a deal. And you should stop. You should stop because the value isn't enough. You should stop because you're not prepared and you are finding problems underneath, whether you are a buyer or a seller. But you shouldn't get carried away on the dream of the deal. You should stop. So corporate doctors, distress sales, values low. Strong businesses with strong core capabilities and a strong ongoing business that can grow anyway, okay, I won't sell. I'll wait to another time in the deal cycle or whatever. But to be carried away just with a corporate finance mandate is not wise. That's why I always like to say in my experience within PwC, we have to be really strong with our clients. Don't buy, do sell, stop. Not buy or sell. You have to be clear with that advice because otherwise we're not doing our job.
There's another thing I wanted to mention. There's a term called heat of the transaction or heat of the deal, which often pushes people to go into the deals even if they feel calmly thinking about it. It's not the right thing. It gets you kind of hyped. It's exciting. You want to get it signed, and then bad deals will happen as well, obviously, as Raymond's explained before.
And I mean, but you see here are only deals that have happened, right? And I'd say that this year alone on some of the sell-side mandates that we have, I think I counted, we have received like 5 or 6 offers. And for all of them, I had to say to the seller, I mean, like I wouldn't sell it if I were you, so I cannot suggest you going ahead with that transaction. I mean, let's see if we can get better deals, or let's just postpone it until better times. As quite often we also get offers, but they're just, I don't know, they're just like fishing for good deals. If you can get something for cheap, let's take it. If not, we're not interested. So, and then I'd say it's not uncommon to have such buyers in the Baltic market, and then it's up to us as advisors to say, well, it's just probably something that we cannot recommend you do.
What does usually the sellers do after your comment? Do they continue or do they stop?
Well, they typically say, well, can you talk with them again? And then you talk with them again and they say, well, we offered you X. Okay. We thought about it again and we're offering you X. And then it's really hard to continue that discussion with them.
Okay.
I think there's one story I will tell of a private business, and I from working with Zlata, I know a little bit about your history and the evolution of business here. And you have a strong entrepreneurial spirit in this country that has come from where you've come from. And what is really interesting, and it's the same not just in Latvia and the Baltics, but across Central Europe, is you're getting second generation coming through. And this is really interesting because it goes to the management point, Raymond, that you were making. I sold a business, a third generation family business to an American conglomerate. There were 3 families. They were in third generation. So you can imagine the number of shareholders. 3, yeah? It was building and building. And so the shareholding had gone like this. The management capability and the closeness of the families to the business was not as close. Management was not very capable. And they saw it as being, we are in a problem now where we cannot continue the family business. It is unsustainable. The business was making great money, had lots of cash, no debt actually, lots of assets. but it was not sustainable for the long term. So sometimes you're selling for a negative reason in a positive way, if that makes sense. And what I think is really interesting about Central Europe is because of the evolution of the where you have come from, you are going to get an interesting dynamic starting to happen as the original entrepreneur gets to the next stage of his development or her development, and maybe is not seeing IPO as the way forward because that can be tricky, and looks and says, okay, do my family want to be in the business? Do they have the passion for it? Do they have the capability for it? Have I got the right management team here? Maybe I now need to think about selling. And I just make the observation, because in the UK we've seen this for many tens of years, but here you're seeing it starting to develop for the first and second time.
It's a very right comment. I think we are just starting to see those cases where several business people who started in the beginning of 90s, and unfortunately more often than not they are saying that I can't see my children taking this business forward, and I can't see the interest, I can't see the capabilities. I've probably spoiled them with the money I've made, so it's better if I actually sold the company to somebody from elsewhere, to professional investor, strategic investor, whoever. So I think it's exactly right that we are starting to see more and more of those transactions. Yeah.
Or the people who found that they are immortal start to die. Then it's again
agreed.
The issue.
What's your forecast for the M&A Baltic, market for the next couple of years? Is it, going to go up, or some stabilization?
I mean, from my perspective, I think it's it's not the market on its own in a sense. Everything depends on what's going to happen elsewhere. And M&A is not. Unfortunately, it's more of a emotional thing rather than rational. So whenever you see sun coming up, people are starting to make more transactions, and if something happens elsewhere and simply the negative emotion spreads around, people get suddenly very careful, not going through with the transactions, not contemplating new ones, and very often there's no rational argument behind it. It's just I don't feel right. Therefore, I think it's very difficult to say what is the forecast. Unfortunately, we are fortunately we are fully dependent on what happens elsewhere.
I have a question to Steven. You mentioned in your presentation the word uncertainty. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and due to the uncertainty, all this M&A acquisition deals is getting less, and value is getting less, and so on. And it's global uncertainty related to Trump and the tariffs and so. Do you think that this global uncertainty can influence also the activities in the Baltic states? Continuing what Tiit said, do you see that this global thing will influence also these small markets which are in Baltics?
It's a good question. I mean, you have just seen BlackRock invest in your neighbouring... Blackstone, sorry. BlackRock was in Germany. So, yeah, Blackstone here. So you are still affected by global investment sentiment, which it goes to the word that Ted was using. So, so I think the answer is you cannot be immune from it. Mm-hmm. I think the movement of the Asian investors in Q1 of this year, which I mentioned, is showing some investor sentiment which is waning. But on the other side, my own view is that private equity is looking, and this happened post-crisis, is looking more and more at the middle market and less at maybe the mega deals. And I think for the Baltics, that's possibly an opportunity. So I'm not a Baltic M&A specialist, but I just look at it and I think logically, okay, the Asians may not be as keen on Europe, but PE is looking at middle market, and typically the Baltics is a middle market M&A market.
Okay. Another word you mentioned is geopolitics.
Oh yeah.
And of course, geopolitics we can interpret different way. But for example, our geopolitics in relation to Russia, Ukraine, all these things, how it's from the Western investors' point of view, does it put some question marks regarding this market itself?
So it's a really good question. And the best way to answer it is to give you a story. So I was involved as a company doctor in a business called Mirklī, which is a huge agribusiness in the Ukraine, absolutely massive. There was a massive fraud, but the underlying assets were very good. It took 3 years, but now it's been bought by Salik. Salik is Saudi Arabian.
Mm-hmm.
It's effectively a sovereign wealth fund. And it has bought for strategic reasons, which comes back to the presentation, regardless of the fact that at the moment that it bought was at the moment that Poroshenko was up against the new comedian guy who has now taken on the presidency. So yes, geopolitics may be a holder back of some of the hunger for the deal, but on the other side, for the right deal, people will invest. Even the most conservative investors will invest on geopolitical tension. So that's one story. The other story reminds, I was just going to mention again what I said before, which is here we have KKR saying because of what Abe has done in Japan, they cited transparency and good governance as a reason for investing in that country. So I completely agree, geopolitics is a really important foundation for good M&A, but it is not the only reason why people will invest. And I was mentioning earlier to one of the guests around ESG investment, so environmental social governance. So these are where investors are not just looking at the value of the deal through traditional M&A, but they're also looking at it from an environmental, a social, or a governance perspective. And I have to say, I look around Latvia and look at all this forestry and all of these trees and all of this natural environment and natural capital and say, wow, there is some really interesting natural assets in the Baltic region.
I have a comment about that as well, and my first answer to you would have been yes, because a few years back we were trying to sell a telecommunication infra asset basically, and then the investors or the interested parties were primarily from Europe, private equity funds, and several of them actually highlighted the sort of Russia risk and buying an infrastructure asset here, how does that expose them to that potential risk? On the other hand, we've just seen recently a deal, it's actually happened in Estonia. There were Dutch and Russian investors selling a transshipment terminal to a UK originated investor based out of Emirates. So that actually, for me, that actually highlights the sort of different geopolitical or geographical measure, that looking at the Baltics from much farther away than Europe, the picture might be different.
Yes.
And obviously, transshipment business today in any of the Baltic countries, maybe Lithuania putting apart, is not a good business in a traditional manner. But when you look at it from Emirates and what sort of fuel flows are you directing, it might be totally different business. So maybe that opens some opportunities for us, for particularly Asian and Arabian businesses coming here and investors coming here.
When I did the Glencore deal, I was looking at Brazil, Argentina. These are not easy countries. As you know, there's been big problems in Venezuela recently. So, the South American market for North American investors has been there for 30 years. And look at the geopolitical tensions in South America, just as another example. If you look from a different lens, which is the point Ted was making.
Mm-hmm. The simplest example is that it's really hard, let's say, for Russian companies to make acquisitions elsewhere. And because when we were talking about some case here with our Russian colleagues and about the companies, well, they said, so we had shortlisted, let's say, I don't know, whatever number of potential buyers, and they said, well, when we take a look at those companies, almost all of them have someone in the shareholders or management who is on the blacklist, and they simply cannot do anything outside of Russia. So, I mean, we've lost one major player because of all the sanctions, who is just simply not actively looking for opportunities, although they used to be quite active in this market as well.
I have a question. You started already talk about. I think during a couple of decades, Baltic states has been in interest of Scandinavian, let's say, investors. So, banking, manufacturing facilities, forests, mainly owned by them. But now we see those couple of deals like Blackstone, Citadel Bank is also owned by United States. Do you see that this also some kind of changing, that we are getting an interest from other investors? Because you told that there is a lot of money in Asia, a lot of money in Arabic countries, but Baltics has never been like an interest on those. Do you see that something is changing here, or?
So first the London view, and then I'll let my colleagues from the Baltics and Latvia answer. From the London view, the emergence of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and these funds from Asia has meant that our London colleagues, so Zlata and my and Tet's and Raymond's London colleagues, are spending their time honestly on their aeroplanes going to meet, liaising with our colleagues in China, liaising with our colleagues in the Middle East, liaising with our colleagues in Canada, to make sure we understand who these people are and what is their investment criteria. Because I think personally that it's about us bringing the buyers to your market. Because if the market has been relatively closed because of communication, perception, sentiment, and also perhaps because the bankers were the first ones here, and from banking comes the link with the other commercial activities. Perhaps there is the opportunity for more awareness of what the Baltics have on offer to a wider audience. Perhaps. It's just a hypothesis from me.
Yeah, I think taking on that, I think perhaps is very good word to use here, because I'm relatively skeptical about forecasting future these days in the environment of information moving really quickly, the emotions moving really quickly, and therefore I think we don't maybe know all the reasons why this shift is happening, if we even can call it a shift. Yeah, but certainly you're right in saying that Scandinavians have I think somewhat pulled back from the Baltics. We see totally new investors here. I think it's to do with the size in some cases. I think it's to do partially with the fact that everything else putting aside, we are still fairly civilized, developed and stable region in the world, which is exploding here and there and there. So maybe that is also an aspect that if you find the safe haven in this madness, if you dramatize a bit, then that's already a good argument for them as well. But then again, coming back to what I said in the beginning, I think we might not realize all the sort of traits and what you have behind those movements, those changes.
I think to Ted's point, it's like it comes back to the deal size, right? So it used to be like that. The funds we're talking maybe starting from 5 million, 10 million. Now the ticket size, I'd say quite often is like 20 million is the minimum, but preferably 50 million. And there's very few companies that meet this criteria. And when you think about the foreign investors, let's say in the US, to get a top manager, let's say to relocate and to the work as a CEO, I say that the very minimum you'd have to pay them is like 250,000 K. Annual salary, probably even for a larger company, closer to 500,000. So you have to have a sizable enough business to justify moving to this new location, and probably you might want to move some of the people. And whenever you're having some of the, let's say, US nationals or other nationals move to the new country, I mean, these are huge investments in comparison to what we have here.
don't forget that investors can combine as well. So I appreciate it may not, but for the bigger deals in the region, you are now getting pension schemes aligning in an investment consortium with PE. So PE plus pensions, or PE plus a fund. So you can have this happening as well. So it's becoming more fluid, I think. In answer to your question, it's becoming more fluid in terms of who and in what combination the investors can come.
One thing that I wanted to mention on the example of Disney and Pixar that Raimond's told is that I think the M&A across the globe really is changing also in a way that since the companies are more and more specialized, the M&A is growing more partnerships. So for instance, the same Pixar Disney thing, I think they were strategic partners for 5-6 years before Disney actually decided to acquire Pixar. And this is a way to minimize or manage your risks that before going right into the transaction, spending a lot of millions, you rather form a strategic partnership, you try each other out, and then if it feels right, if it actually works out, then you go and do a transaction as well in a sort of environment which is much better known to you. You know, you've been having time to analyze everything. So this is actually a growing trend across the globe, also based on what PwC has studied around the world.
I have a question on this. What is the usual legal form of such strategic partnerships? Is it some kind of SPV or simple basis of memorandum initially, or how it works in practice?
Well, if we go back to Raimond's a good deal and a bad deal, cost structures and sharing cost structures is often driving a good deal, and capex related as well, actually. So yeah, joint venture around maybe sharing logistics, maybe so in my industry, which is the food industry, sharing a distribution hub, sharing some logistics, sharing capex in relation to, say, some energy from food waste might be another example. But these ways of learning to work with each other through probably a JV structure is the most common that I have seen, but my colleagues may have seen different things.
If I may, actually we're right now working with the sort of on the creation of the partnership. And in Latvia, if we're talking about Latvia, in Scandinavia it is more the agreement. The partnership is working under the agreement, so the two partners continue as a legal entity and they just join, you know, as partners in terms of as a deal. Yeah. In Latvia, it does not work particularly well. So in Latvia, normally the separate legal entity, SPV, is created as a legal structure with a 50-50 or whatever partnership, 30-30-30 or whatever partnership it is there. So it is more based on the formal legal contract.
And any experience with Asian countries?
I think the Asian, we have done in the TLS sort of tax and legal some structuring for the Asian investors. I think what they are doing, they prefer to have control.
Yeah.
And I think this is where for them it is more acquisition rather than investment. If they leave some investment, they leave really like a 30 to 20% stakeholding. So mainly they're going as not as a equal investors, but as a bigger investor in the shape. But again, with the legal entity, not with the partnership as it is in the other countries, like agreement-wise.
I have a question. We know about those all three pillars of the due diligence. We usually see like legal, tax, and finance. But do you see that IT part is coming in as a fourth pillar, and maybe cybersecurity as one of the things there?
I mean, it's growingly a topic. I think it depends a little bit on how well educated the acquirers themselves are. I think, and whether they do it in-house but certainly, if you raise it as one of the risk areas, then cyber is very very, very important for everybody these days. So whatever way they tackle it, I think it's always on the minds of the investors. By the way, the deal that I mentioned earlier, that we are at the moment doing quite large one, which is kind of a little bit related to IT, and they certainly have systems, platforms that they're using for making the business. There, the investors actually, as part of the due diligence process, they wanted to do penetration testing. So there you go. I mean, and this is a large deal with European global private equities. So I guess it depends on the size of the deal, how big are the risks, but certainly an important aspect these days.
I think it could be a fourth pillar. I think to Tet's point, it could just be assumed in each pillar almost, because it's just a language, part of the business. Yeah. But I think the ethical, the hacking, penetration tests, I think absolutely. I think it's critical now. I really do. In pretty much every business that we see, GDPR, the European regulations in relation to the holding of data, just as a very simple example, and the responsibilities on owners.
No, just to add to that, I think again a lot depends on the industry, particular industry, and the size of the deal. As I think in the US, I was in due diligence where we had 11 work streams / pillars, and that was due diligence for a hospital. Mm-hmm. So besides the forementioned ones, there was also operational, commercial, technical, like healthcare, where they were looking at and regulatory healthcare as well as just like talking to doctors and so forth. So I think if in Latvia, let's say, or in Baltics, just a regular manufacturing company is acquired, the requirements and due diligence would be quite different to, let's say, what Blackstone, I'd imagine, conducted for the Luminor Bank. And in that case, I'm pretty sure that they were looking also for like IT, IML, and all the other aspects that come into the equation.
Colleagues, any other questions? All right, then I would like to say that thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for questioning. I know that